So, for those of you who might not be aware of Manomet Conservation Sciences, I'll just do a brief introduction. Our headquarters is in Plymouth, Massachusetts, but our work spans the Americas, and with focusing on coastal resilience, education, and what will be the crux of this presentation, our shorebird recovery strategy. And because of the wide-ranging migratory pathways of the shorebirds we work with, we have staff presented throughout the Americas, from southern South America all the way up to Alaska. But for this presentation and the focus of this conference, we'll be mostly focusing on our work here in Massachusetts. And I have several colleagues in the room here, including Brad Wynn, Liana D'Annunzio, and Mike Molnar. So if you see them after the presentation and have additional questions, feel free to hunt them down. Just to present a little bit of context of why shorebirds, and this is a graphic that just shows the trends of shorebirds in general. And you can see that they're one of the fastest declining guilds of bird species in North America, right down there with desert birds and grassland birds. And because of this, they require a lot of focused conservation action, which we know takes place here in Massachusetts. And some shorebird threats to think about in this context that are driving these declines range from habitat loss and degradation to potential limited food resources, disturbance by human activity, and predation and hunting. And before I get into some of Manomet's work addressing some of these threats here in Massachusetts, I just wanted to go on a brief little history lesson about even just in the last 150 years or so, the story of market hunting of shorebirds here in Massachusetts, and some progress we've made in terms of regulations that have helped end hunting in the state. But this is a quote from John James Audubon describing the hunting of the now extinct Eskimo curlew here in Massachusetts. And he says, during their short stay in the state, the Eskimo curlew are met with on the high sandy hills near the seashore, where they feed on grasshoppers and on several kinds of berries. On this food they become fat so as to afford excellent eating, in consequence of which they have probably acquired the name of doe bird, which they bear in that district, but which is also applied to several other birds. How this species manages to cross the whole extent of the United States without being seen after leaving Massachusetts is to me very wonderful. And the reason the Eskimo curlew was filling up with berries was preparing for its migration down to South America. And here's just a little excerpt from some hunting journals within Massachusetts in the late 1800s, just very matter-of-factly documenting the hunting of curlews and American golden plovers and the like. But thankfully, at least within Massachusetts, that's a thing of the past. And while we do have shorebird declines, there are a few species that are doing pretty well now. One, the willet on the right, which most of you recognize, was actually hunted to extinction as a breeding bird in Massachusetts, but has now recovered and is breeding widely throughout salt marshes in the state. And we have, of course, the piping plover and the American oystercatcher, which, thanks to very rigorous managing of their coastal breeding sites, are actually showing some population recovery, and is a credit to all the resource managers who are driving that work. So, as a preface, I just wanted to dig back again into Manomet's approach to shorebird conservation, which includes both scientific approach, but then also identifying key sites for conservation, and then within those sites, how to improve their habitats. And it's within that context that I'll be speaking on just a couple approaches Manomet's using to identify these key sites within Massachusetts and some of the issues facing the birds. And so one effort I'll touch on here is called the Massachusetts Shorebird Blitz, which is coordinated by Liana right there, and maybe we have some participants here and here. But this is now in the third year of study of a method of trying to catch a more holistic snapshot of the distribution of shorebirds within the state during this peak migratory period, particularly during August, when these birds are using Massachusetts as a staging area, migrating south, coming out of the Arctic and boreal breeding grounds. And so here's the image of the most recent results from our survey in 2025, which is a volunteer-based survey of as many sites as possible, basically, both big and small. And the goal is to go out and count shorebirds and see the numbers and distribution of birds and what sites are the biggest, which sites have the most diversity, but then also how birds are doing at smaller sites. And as you can see, in the 2025 results, we were able to engage 123 participants, surveying 232 sites, and counted over 85,000 shorebirds of 25 species. And here on Cape Cod, we're blessed with having some of the largest sites in the state, some of which you may be familiar with, including Manomet National Wildlife Refuge, Nauset Marsh, and Eastham, Sandy Neck, Barnstable, and then also Third Cliff and Scituate off of the Cape. And before I show the top 10 species by numbers, does anyone want to guess, shout out what they think the number one species was in terms of numbers during August? Anyone bold enough to guess? What was that? That is correct. Very nice. And in fact, number two was also semi-palmated, but the semi-palmated plover. And just let you observe here for some of the top species. And noted this is just during August, so there might be some species that come through later in the season. And but shout out to these species. And just as we build this database of this comprehensive survey of the state, we're excited to be able to use this for various data applications, some of which are in process already with some partners, including looking at, as this stretches over a longer period of time, looking at population estimates and trends, and then also looking at site comparisons. And so this is a graphic that our partner Rebecca Linhart at URI has created, which actually shows some of the largest sites I was describing in the paler colors, but then the cumulative numbers of all the small sites on the right column actually adds up to over 50,000 shorebirds themselves. So it highlights that a network of small sites and pairing with these larger sites is really valuable, and the numbers really start to stack up. And so we're looking forward to continuing to dig into that and make sure that people who are managing both sites big and small understand the importance for these migratory shorebirds. So I'm going to shift gears to the second chapter of my presentation here and talk a little bit about northbound migration. So that stuff there was about southbound migration, birds heading south from their breeding grounds, and now we're talking about what's going on in the spring, in May and June, when birds are coming north. And for that, I wanted to touch on some of our work with horseshoe crabs within the state and the connection between horseshoe crabs and shorebirds. And the story is pretty well known, generally speaking, for those who work with wildlife, particularly associated with Delaware Bay and the importance of horseshoe crab eggs and during the spawning period, fueling birds on their northbound migration. But what is less known is the current status and relationship between these horseshoe crabs and shorebirds in Massachusetts. Now, there's plenty of accounts from decades, centuries ago of large numbers of shorebirds associating with horseshoe crab spawning events in the state, but currently phenomena such as that are pretty limited within the state to sites such as Manomet National Wildlife Refuge, where the harvest of horseshoe crabs for both the bait and biomedical industry has been banned since the early 2000s. And so a couple of things that we've just been interested in organizationally the last few years is what is the evidence of shorebirds relying on horseshoe crab eggs and how much are they relying on them? And these are a couple photos by Brad, who's sitting over there, of some amazing photos. So, as I mentioned, just a couple things we're looking to dig in on. And so this is focused in on some spring migration research at Manomet National Wildlife Refuge to see what's going on. And just for a reminder, Manomet National Wildlife Refuge down there at the elbow of the Cape, and we're seeing, over 100,000 shorebirds annually, but generally the understanding of how many shorebirds are there in the spring is much less understood. So in addition to the shorebird surveys, we've spent the last few years partnering with an organization called Lighthawk, which provides they provide aerial survey support for nonprofits at a discount charge. And so we've been able to actually start to doing some aerial documentation of horseshoe crab spawning events. And this is what it looks like within Manomet National Wildlife Refuge, where the harvest has been limited for the last 20 years and banned entirely. And so this is from the sky view, but then down closer up we're seeing during May and June these focal species and their nice breeding plumage. And so the ruddy turnstone, red knot, dunlin, and sanderling. And so we've been interested in looking into what food is available for the birds. And so once again, partnering with the University of Rhode Island, we've been looking at invertebrate sampling as well as horseshoe crab egg density surveys to see what sort of food is available to the birds, and particularly pairing this methodology with work in Delaware Bay and involving something called the horseshoe crab egg density surveys, which go beyond just surveying the number of spawning adult crabs, but start to look at the actual density both on the surface, which are crabs that are available for shorebirds for eating, as well as further under the surface where you identify these egg clusters, which you can see a photo of in the top left. And we've been doing these surveys for a couple of years now and starting to produce some preliminary results. And the take-home message here is that we see some peak surface egg density of about 6,500 eggs during late May and early June, which is coinciding with the peak passage of shorebird numbers. And just for reference, this 6,000 number, the average peak surface egg density in Delaware Bay is around 10,000. So same order of magnitude, but slightly less. But what we're really excited is to start being able to document this density in a site such as Manomet, where the harvest of the crabs has been banned, unlike the rest of the state. So I know that was a bit of a whirlwind. The last thing I'll just show you is that another component of that work on Manomet has been tracking the birds, particularly the ruddy turnstone, as they depart Manomet. And so this is some of the satellite tracking data we've documented just over the last year. These are 4 turnstones that left Manomet in early June and then headed up to their breeding grounds in the Canadian Arctic. And this is folding into work along the Atlantic seaboard, mapping out turnstones in particular, their migratory pathways. And just highlights how Massachusetts is this launching point, both northbound and southbound, for birds that are traversing the Americas and rely a great deal on what goes on here in Massachusetts. That's it, and I'm happy time is up. And I do have a few minutes to go back to any of those topics and dig a little bit deeper or answer any questions anyone has.
Thanks, Alan. So I know the coffee has kicked in for this side, I know. So we're going to start with questions and give you the opportunity. We have time for 2 questions. So any takers on this side of the room? You all raised your hands, loving shorebirds, working with shorebirds. So I know. Any takers? No. All right. We're going to go over here. Please introduce yourself.
Good morning. Frank Noyes, Eco Tour boat captain out of Pleasant Bay. On On one of the slides, you showed where the various bird populations were advancing and some of them declining. Wonder if you could just maybe do a little drill down comment on that.
The population trends,
Yes, please.
yeah. This one?
Yes.
So, this is showing population trend in various guilds of species over the last 50 years or so with a bunch of different data inputs. It's not all the same data sources, but this basically shows, zero horizontal being even for steady populations. You can see, for example, sea ducks have been fairly steady over the last 50 years, whereas dabbling ducks are going up. And then there's some guilds of species that have been steadily declining. And the shorebirds in particular, one of the key data sources for these trends is actually a volunteer-based program called the International Shorebird Survey that Manomet runs, that where folks monitor key staging sites and are able to document trends over long periods of time through regular surveys. There's a lot of different stories behind all these different groups of birds. Eastern forest birds are declining just due to general loss of breeding habitat. And grassland birds, particularly in the east, are actually, a lot of the grassland habitat is reforesting or getting developed, and the loss of farmland and things such as that. But do you have something else specific?
Yes, that's really what I was interested in, was what some of the key drivers are for the increases and key drivers for the decreases.
Well, one nice thing about dabbling ducks is that they're hunted, so there's a great amount of investment in land management for waterfowl, particularly in terms of the whole National Wildlife Refuge system, particularly on the East Coast, was established to help support dabbling duck populations and the impoundments and things such as that. And so there's a great amount of investment in having stable and increasing duck populations, which is also an interesting thing to try to piggyback shorebird conservation along with, particularly in the Mississippi alluvial valley and the mid-continent, where there's a lot of non-tidal habitats that just with a little bit of tweaking can provide habitat for shorebirds as well as waterfowl.